Okay, so I think we shall begin. So, hello and welcome to the first in a series of communication webinars designed to show the core role communications will be playing in the employee experience going forwards. As always, we want these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so please send us your questions, thoughts, comments. If you want to disagree with anything that myself and Alexandra say, we're more than happy to have debates, so please kind of let us know if you want to agree with anything we're doing or anything we say, or you want to share experiences, how maybe you've communicated over the last 12 months that you'd like to share with us in the audience, then please do that. And my very special guest today is Alexandra Houlden, Head of Communications at Benefix. Good morning, Alexandra. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Same as you. This is kind of hump day. These webinars are always on a Wednesday, so they always mark the kind of curving over. So you're one of our internal experts. We've had a few internal Benefix experts on these webinars. For those people who don't know you, could you just give us a little bit about yourself and your background, please?
Sure. So I head up our communication team. So we work with our customers to communicate with their employees about benefits, reward, or anything HR related. Personally, I'm passionate about the difference that great communication can make to people's lives. And ultimately, you know, the role that we play is to help our customers to engage their employees with the organisations that they run and the jobs that they're doing. I have a team of consultants who specialise in internal communications, but also have a creative team of copywriters and designers who help to bring those customers' communications to life.
Excellent, good stuff. And I think what I've loved about since you've joined Benefix, I feel like communications has very much so stopped becoming a bit of a function to get people to do things, and has been this kind of fabric of how do we talk to people and the language we use. And I'm sure we'll come on to some of that, but I think the role of that you've done and brought on some of those consultants has been really important part of us showing the language we use, and the communication has been a really important part of that employee experience. So excited to hear some more of your thoughts on that. So Alexandra, wellbeing has clearly played a central role in employee benefit schemes over the last year, and anyone listening to this webinar who's been to any of these previous webinars that we've done has kind of seen that very strong wellbeing theme run through them. And as I mentioned, it seems like we're starting to see more and more employers see communications less of a function. And so when it comes to benefits, you know, communication is always, how do we get somebody to increase
Do
the
something.
Exactly. And we seem to be moving away from that. And what we're going to cover today is going to show our audience how they can make the best use of communications so that people can thrive in this new hybrid model of work that's going to be with millions of us for years to come. And so today we're going to talk about how we champion the changes many employers have made, and how to champion the changes you will make to your benefit schemes over the next year or so. And we'll also talk about how best to support remote and office-based staff. And finally, we'll show you how you can demonstrate your support to your people through actions and not just words. So my first question to you, Alexandra, big changes to the way we work. Does that mean we have to change the way we communicate?
So I don't think our overall approach needs to change, but I think the importance of doing it well has definitely increased in the last year. You're now communicating with employees who are physically detached from you as an organisation. They're also, you know, fatigued for the last year, and now they're trying to re-navigate the world sort of as we come out of lockdown. So whereas in the past you might have had some benefit of the doubt from your employees, and you may have had some really cost-effective communication channels to reach them, you're now more actively competing for their attention.
Interesting. So I guess you're saying it's more important to communicate change well, because I guess we've seen this kind of the one consistent has been the inconsistency, I guess, over the last 12 months. And, you know, if everyone's to go back to work tomorrow, the pandemic doesn't end, right? Countries like the UK and the US, it might end there before it ends elsewhere, but it's going to be with us for some time. So how do you do that? How do you continually communicate through that ongoing change?
So when you're communicating change, no matter how big or how small, it's really important to put the employee first and think about what they need to hear. So there are two things you really need to consider and to communicate. Why you're making that change, you need to make that really clear. But you also make it crystal clear to your employees the benefit to them and why it matters to them. We call this the so what, or the why should I care. As an employee, why should I care about these changes? The pandemic has made a lot of our customers and also our benefit providers look again at their offering and the services they're providing. And so if you're making changes to your scheme, they may actually at the moment be quite small tweaks to the offering rather than sort of whole scale benefit changes. Maybe your providers have added video consultation in as an option to deliver the benefits that they provide. Or maybe you're looking at your medical coverage and extending that in certain ways and expanding that to cover more instances. So I've put together just a little summary of a way that we would think about this when we're communicating change and how we would take this why and so what and create a message.
Okay, great.
So it looks something like this. So fairly simple, just talking about adding in a video consultation, a will writing benefit. This is definitely one we've seen in the last year. It's effectively quite a small change, but the why is really important. We've made this change, the employers are making this change, benefit providers are making this change so that employees can still access their benefits during a pandemic. Still being able to use the benefits that they've paid for is really is fundamental. But for the employee, that means that it's really easy for them to use this benefit. It's actually probably easier than it was before, rather than having to travel and maybe take time off, if it was a weekday, having to book that in around work. Now it can be done around work, maybe in a lunch break. We've also seen that maybe when these changes have impacted the cost, that's then been passed on to the employee as well. So the so what for the employee is actually, if you let this benefit, it might even cost you a little bit less.
And I guess within that, there's some inclusivity pieces, right? So you're making the benefit more accessible to people who might not find it easy to leave the home or the workplace to have those meetings. And so I guess that can form part of the messaging as well, can't you? Because you want it to be available to more people. So you're making that change. And I think explaining those ways is going to be really important, right? I think you and I have both seen that many customers will offer new benefits and they think it's implied, the understanding as to why we're offering that benefit. And I guess, I've always seen internal communications as like advertising, and America consumes, I think, 65% of all the world's advertising. If advertising didn't work, people wouldn't be spending so much money on it. And so that constant reminding people of the why, I think, is really, really important and gets missed quite a lot. I think we make some assumptions that people understand why we're doing things, when I just don't think that's the case.
At the moment, when people's attention is so short, you are battling at home for, 6 months ago, you were battling against homeschooling and other things going on, but you've got Instagram pulling their time away, you've got Facebook pulling their time away. That's where employees might go and get a couple of minutes respite in between meetings. Actually, how do you make them read the email that you've sent them instead? You're really thinking about that from advertising is a great example. We look, within my team, we love to share when we see a good advert to get some inspiration.
Yeah, so I think it's fascinating. I think we are overloaded with messages at every point of our days, whether that's advertisements, whether that's emails. Everybody is nudging you to do something. And employers are the challenge for employers is you're cutting through the same noise, right? You're trying to reach people and get them to do something or understand something. At the same time, they get notifications from social media and emails and WhatsApps and text messages. And so you've really got to think about how can I get the why to people really quickly as well, I think is important.
Yeah, so this was just looking at the messaging. I've also got, some thoughts around how we communicate those to champion. I think the picture we were looking at what we're going to cover in this webinar, I thought was really interesting that we're talking about championing change. When we talk about communicating change, that can be done poorly. But obviously when we talk about championing, actually the focus then is around doing that well. So there's some other things I thought I'd share with the group here as well around sort of communicating change.
Yes, please. Thank
you. The first thing is around tailoring to the audience. And when you're thinking about benefit changes, you've actually got two key audiences that you can consider. Those that have the benefit already. If you're making changes to a benefit that's going to roll over or that people are going to elect next year, you want to really make sure that those that have the benefit really understand the changes that you're making. Is there a new app they can download? Is there a new service that they now have access to? Making sure that that message gets through to those people in a way that you know, it can be as simple as, we know you've elected this benefit and here are the changes for this year. Just really target that messaging and that approach around those. The second group is those that don't have the benefit. It's interesting you mentioned advertising. These changes are a fantastic opportunity to go out and re-promote. What you may find is that the things that you've implemented and the changes that you've made actually then become a benefit that's right for a new group of people. You mentioned the diversity element around will writing. That's exactly something we've seen. You know, during this change, some things have got more accessible, actually.
Sorry, my building alarm's just going off. That is. But one of the interesting things I think I saw recently where companies have started to do this is I was listening to the radio a couple of days ago, and Aviva were talking about their income protection product. And anyone that's been to any of these webinars knows I'm a big fan of income protection. And what was really interesting is, obviously, as we've seen at Benefix, people have been using that benefit in a very different way since the pandemic started, because we've started to tell employers that, you know, you have this insurance policy, but it has all these optional extras that might help your people through the pandemic. So they can speak to a doctor via video, they can get mental health supports, read content and all that kind of stuff. Earlier this week, when I heard the new advert from Aviva about their income protection policy, they were talking about those additional services as the primary elements of that, and oh yes, and it's insurance second. So they flipped that based on demand to actually say, you buy this product and it will help you, and it gives you the support and it gives you access to experts. Oh, and by the way, if you can't work because of your mental health, it will also cover your income during that time. And I thought that was a fascinating example of how the message has been changed to suit the needs of the employees. Historically, it just didn't, that messaging wasn't the same.
It's really interesting around insurance as well. I always think it's something you hope you don't have to use. And so, you know, you're paying for something you hope you're never going to have to access. Having those additional services and bringing those to the forefront actually brings a value to the pounds and pence that you're paying for that.
Yeah, and the immediacy, right? We talk, lots of the stuff I talk about with behavioral science is our over indexing on the present. We value the present over the future so much, which makes things like insurance products really difficult for people to engage with, because you're buying something that will cover you against something that may or may not happen in some long distant future you can't identify with. But if you're showing the benefit today of buying this product, then I think that is really powerful as well.
The add-ons to how you differentiate as well, isn't it? Like I could go and get my income protection from a variety of different providers. So what? Why should I choose you? Those added extras are the reason that someone will make a purchasing decision.
And I think, you know, a great example, I think, of how anyone listening to this who's involved in benefits can think about how do we take something we've had for a long time and re-engineer the way we communicate and tailor that message to a new audience or to solve different problems for people.
It's a great example. I really love it. But when we're thinking about change, we can also look at the approach that we take to champion that. And I've just summarised this as big changes, make a splash. You know, if you're making big changes to a benefit, set up a webinar with the provider, make it a feature of the campaign. You know, make sure that the investment that you've made in changing that benefit, or potentially, you know, increasing the cost for the employer, is really sort of getting bang for the buck on your communications.
So what I really like about what you've put here is we are, and I think any employee experience design works exactly the same way, is you're kind of empathizing with the individual. You know, that's a really strong design principle in almost anything that you're building. But you're thinking about what is the end result? What do I want that person to do or understand? What action do I want them to take? And then I'm working backwards from that way. So it really focuses on the employee at the end of that communication. And so how do you, so with all of this in mind, I mentioned before about that hybrid workforce and how people are going to be working in different locations and different working patterns. How do we consider those types of people in all of this as well?
Yeah, you're right. You know, our workforce is not what it was a year ago, and actually it's unlikely to go back to that way again. So yeah, there's a few key things I'd sort of think about. You know, even as we're returning to offices, we've proven that remote working works. You know, we've got teams that we didn't think would ever operate, you know, functionally from home, that have actually been proved exactly the opposite. And this hybrid working environment is definitely here to stay. And actually that's more difficult. That's a more difficult environment to communicate in. At the moment, if everyone's at home, In a business like Benefex, everyone's at home at the moment. Everyone gets an equitable experience. Everyone is dialing onto the same webinar, the same, all employee function to find out the news and what's going on. As we start to move where we've got a situation where some people are working from home one day, some people are in the office one day, actually it gets more difficult to provide that equitable communication approach and to communicate effectively.
I guess it's understanding as well, with lots of these webinars we talked about, the inequalities that exist in the society have kind of been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we know that everyone's experience of the pandemic has been very different, and what they've struggled with and the challenges they've faced have been very different. And, you put well-being on the slide there, and clearly that's been a big theme of everything we've been putting out for this year. So I guess part of that is thinking about if somebody is now in this mindset of I'm concerned or more interested in my well-being than I was before, data out today in the UK, 1 in 5 employees say they felt depressed in the last 12 months. Kind of no surprise, but if we look at how many people use the term well-being or mental health online, the trend has been growing for years that the general public are more interested in their own well-being. So do you tailor some of the messages to what people are most interested in at the moment? And I think the challenge for people like Benefex has been for a long time is what well-being is and how we talk about well-being. The market goes straight to a product. I have a well-being challenge. How do I solve that with a product? When actually lots of the things employers are already doing, the way organizations are structured and the way you communicate is all well-being. And you mentioned about Benefex doing kind of company updates and making that equitable experience. That's all been this acknowledgement of, we know you're struggling, we know you are being challenged, we are listening to you, we want to hear what you've got to say. That's all been a communications tool. So lots of what well-being has been like for you and I as Benefex employees has been the way that Benefex has spoken to us and the language they've used. So they haven't changed their approach so much, but we've become more empathetic in the language we use, and that I think has supported our well-being, which is fascinating. And so, kind of communications. How do you support that type of workforce then with all these changes that you put on your screen?
Super. Yeah. So there are a few things we'll be thinking about. So remote working isn't actually a new concept. There've always been employees that don't work in the office every day or have limited access to digital channels, and that's typically how we would sort of identify a remote workforce. But in the last year, that landscape's changed dramatically. So yeah, some teams have actually been more focused and more productive, whereas others have really struggled. We mustn't forget that this situation has been working from home in a pandemic. This hasn't been what an ordinary work from home setup has been. So you need to think about how your employees are going to access the communications they receive, and the channels that you're using and the time that you're sending that out. So your communication channels are going to be really key going forward. It's never been more important to think about a multi-channeled campaign when you're communicating, sending out an email. To be honest, if you had a remote workforce in the past, maybe if you had people that were on shop floors or working out on the road or in people's homes, traditionally they didn't really have access to email to start with. So a single channel email campaign was never going to hit that mark anyway. So yeah, as we transition back, making sure that we're thinking about how we're going to reach those employees and how those employees are going to consume those communications will be really, really key to our success.
I find the timing stuff and the access is kind of fascinating, because if we think back to that advertising model, marketeers know an awful lot of data. I remember seeing a talk about people analytics and communications by I think the head of employee experience at Avon a few years ago, and this guy said, we know to the second how many lipsticks we sell every day, but we've got no idea whether emails are opened by employees or not and how many of them engage in it. And so you're kind of taking that marketing view of actually when's the right time to send stuff out, because we know, like, take social media, we know if you want the best engagement, there are certain days and times to post on LinkedIn, and they are different to the way you post on Instagram and Twitter, and marketeers get this. And I think the timing becomes much more interesting when you don't know where everyone is and what they're doing. So Monday morning at Benefex, everyone used to be pretty much in the office because you had all the kind of sales kickoff meetings for the week and lots of the team meetings. that will obviously disperse, and those meetings will probably now take place over different points of the week. So you now don't have a day where you know everyone's going to be in the office, which was always something we used to plan on before. And so I think that kind of stuff is fascinating, I think, around how communicating. What's interesting as well is you and I have been working on this Benefex Save Smart product that we've been building, and that is built a lot around giving people the right access at the right time in the right way to get the best results. So a lot of thought has gone into kind of the best time to send this out. Send this out at lunchtime when we know somebody got 10 minutes to read it, for example. It is really, really important. So I think this bit's fascinating.
It's interesting that you mention insight and data. I think that's something we have to, as internal communicators, rely on a lot more now. People's work days are not 9 to 5 anymore. And as I mentioned homeschooling and things before, but when people were working earlier and later in the day in order to sandwich in that time during the day to homeschool, you really needed to be thinking about, actually, is it better if I schedule this to send at 6 o'clock in the morning? It may seem quite extreme, but actually, is that then the first thing people are seeing when they're waking up, checking their emails? It was never a good idea to send a serious email that needed action at 5 o'clock on a Friday. And that's also something around the access we need to be thinking about. Actually, we're communicating with employees who are at home. You've been given unprecedented access to people's home lives in the last year, and being really considerate of the fact that if you're sending challenging messages or things that need action, just making sure that that's coming in at considerate time, and you're not asking people to do things then into their evenings.
Excellent. Before we move on to my next point, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any comments, if anything we've talked about so far has been interesting, not interesting, don't let us know if it's not interesting, but if you think it's interesting, please let us know. If you want to share how your organization or you have communicated during the pandemic and things you've used that have been really effective, please share those stories. I think lots of us would benefit from hearing examples of how other people have done that. Alexandra, one of the things I think about when I think about communications is, when we think about most people's experience at work, for many, it's almost entirely the experience they have with their manager. So if you work in a 60,000 person organization, those goals and corporate communications can sometimes get a bit lost. And so it's as you get a bit more kind of provincial and the teams around you there and the departments you work in, those communications, I think, end up being quite important. And I've spoken a lot on these webinars about line managers, and line managers, I think, really important role in well-being and delivering that great experience. And one of the things that always sticks in my mind about, I've seen managers do in the past, is not think about how they communicate and not think about the language they use. And a classic one I'm sure everyone's experienced is the late night Friday message that kind of says, oh, by the way, need to have a chat about that project on Monday. And obviously most people go straight to
something's wrong.
Yeah, that's a really anxious experience. And that's not because anyone's intended to do it that way, but the kind of the runoff of that is that people feel pretty anxious about that experience at work, and it really hits home, I think, as an example about how managers don't always think about the best ways that communicate, and kind of why should they? Because unless we've trained them in communicators, you've got a team of trained, experienced, qualified communicators and consultants. Most team managers don't have that experience. So when we're kind of considering that, our managers now, they've got to be more important, right? Since we've been working from home, FaceTime with your manager and the communications you get from your manager are more important. So I know you've got a slide on that. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of manager's role in communications, please?
Yes. Sorry, I don't have a slide on that. It was all wrapped up in this one. So we're doing here. But yeah, line managers are absolutely fundamental. What we've experienced over the last year is actually we've stretched those line managers probably to breaking point. They have been such a vital communication channel for our teams. Working remotely means that your circle has got smaller. I don't know about you, but I have found that I will occasionally jump on a call and there'll be someone I haven't spoken to in 6 months that I would have seen in the kitchen, if I'd have been in the office. So, and had a chat and caught up with them. Actually, your employees' circles have got very small. They are only interacting with the people they deliver work with now. And so that line manager has become exactly what you've just said, that absolutely pivotal point into making sure that communications are cascaded appropriately. So yeah, upskilling line managers is hopefully going to be sort of key on people's agendas over the next. You're right, lots of line managers don't have communication training. They haven't, that hasn't been sort of something that's been invested in them. It's quite a soft skill, but making sure that they're able to do that effectively is really important. You know, when we're in the office, if you had a line manager who didn't communicate effectively, that'd actually be quite diluted, because you'd have co-workers and colleagues and associates that would, you know, that would fill in the gaps and would do that. Actually, poor communication from line managers now is much more vital.
And so to your earlier point about the kind of why, if we are making a change to our benefits platform, and the data tells us most people listening to this webinar have and will be making more, champion those managers to understand why you're making those changes is clearly really important, right? So if an employee has questions, it's likely they will go to their manager to ask those questions. And so that manager really needs to be informed as to kind of, if we're adding or changing that benefit, why are we doing that? And what do we hope the outcome is? So we're not just cascading that message as in, we're adding this new level of cover. We're explaining to those people, we're adding it because of this, and this is the result we expect. Managers need to have that information, right?
Yeah, when we think about stakeholders in campaigns, line managers are always real key stakeholders to make sure that they're getting sort of the news up front, and then they're able to support that campaign. Yeah, we typically think about line managers, also HR teams, and making sure that any wider sort of business partners are aware of what's going on. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be difficult. It could just be a webinar that you get people on, or you join a meeting that everyone is already joining, and present for 5 minutes on what those changes are, and people walk away with that knowledge. It doesn't have to be sort of a new deliverable and something that's delivered. Actually, it's potentially just a little bit of time to make sure that's been communicated well.
Anything else that you think we should be rethinking in this new world?
I just think we need to think about that traditional remote population and what their experience is going to be like. You know, people on shop floors, people on factory floors potentially have been in their place where they do their work all of this time. Talking about returning to the office, if you have that population, it may alienate. I think it's really important that you understand your employee base when you're communicating, and making sure that the messaging that you're going out with is going to be equitable for all. So you're talking about actually a return to business as usual, rather than because their business as usual may not have changed.
A really important point. You know, I read this morning, which I was quite surprised at. I think it's 38% of people, 36 to 38% of people in the UK have worked from home at some other point over the last 12 months. That means the vast majority haven't. Mm-hmm. So when you think the mainstream media has been filled with home working news and people working remotely, and that's actually been a very small minority really of the general population. And I think in a recent study by, I think it was the IFS released this week, they looked at the number of councils and boroughs across the UK and populations of people that worked from home. There was only about 7 of those boroughs where 50% or more of the people worked from home, actually the vast majority of people. And there's a country divide as well. So when you start looking at the north of England, the vast majority of workers in the north of England did not work from home during the pandemic. So yeah, it's really interesting, I think, to see the issue is not as big as you lead it to believe based on the amount that people are talking about it. So I think it's a really important point that if you don't have people who are working from home, you know, Benefix has an organization where we all are able to, and even pre-pandemic, we're able to work from home. But if you're an organization that has engineers and technicians and people on the road, and that hasn't changed, I think, yeah, that language is really, really important. You don't want to create a divide between those who can and those who can't.
And I mean, if people are out working in other people's homes, they're having to take extreme caution now, and PPE, and that's been a huge change to the way they work. That probably isn't going to go back. You know, people will probably continue to wear masks when they're going into people's, you know, when they're working in people's homes for the foreseeable. So I think, yeah, just being considerate of that.
And has anyone benefited from this new kind of the way we've worked? So it's allowed people to communicate in different ways, and arguably some better ways. So people would have benefited from some of these changes, surely.
Yes, it's those international teams that maybe felt a bit disconnected previously. You know, we've had feedback that those groups now feel like they're more involved. what we've had to do in the last year is relook at everything and think about what we're doing and the best way to do things. So groups that may have been sidelined before or may not have received sort of the same experience as everyone else previously actually may have benefited communication wise during this last year and may feel better connected to what's going on. So we shouldn't lose that ground that we've built up over the last year. I think it's really important to not just go back to what we were doing before. Don't assume that what you were doing before was actually meeting the needs of everyone. Take this as an opportunity to reset.
Yeah, we spoke about this on the webinar with our Chief People Officer, Catherine Kendall, last week, or the week before. At one point in Benefex's history, I think I was the only person with a home working contract. And I live 2.5 hours away from the office. This has been a great leveler for me, this whole pandemic at work, because it's meant that I've been able to have more FaceTime with people that I've never, you and I have had much more FaceTime over the last 12 months than we had when I went to the office. Lots more junior members of staff have been able to kind of spend time with me and kind of have had ad hoc meetings. So yeah, for some people, they've really benefited from that kind of new way of communicating. Company updates were always quite challenging for me to do if I had customer meetings in London, then had to go down to Southampton. But by moving those virtually, I'm not missing out on any of the messages that I used to before, because I logistically couldn't get to the places that I needed to be. So I think that's fascinating.
We've also hired more remotely, right? We haven't been restricting ourselves to the areas where our businesses operate. So it's really, again, really important that you haven't then recruited across the business, across the country, and then suddenly go back to a London-centric or a Southampton-centric approach, because we've been thinking differently about how we bring in new staff as well.
Yeah, I think the international stuff is fascinating, because I'd only spoken at a handful of conferences before the pandemic internationally. I've spoken at double the amount I had before since. So I've been able to kind of do a conference talk in London and then a conference talk in America in the afternoon. I have one at 11 o'clock next Thursday evening in Barbados. So you kind of have,
I'm sure you would prefer to have gone to that one though.
But yeah, I just think that's fascinating. It's really interesting to hear with international reward and benefits teams. I think you and I both know that one of the things that reward and benefits team internationally struggle with is creating a framework that covers the world and different regions, but also enabling those regions to then bespoke and make decisions on a local level. Mm-hmm. And so I think having that more structured framework about, rather than just pushing stuff on people, actually involving them in those decisions, has been fascinating. I'm sure everyone on this call has become a lot more familiar with time zones over the last 12 months as well, which I think is, again, really fascinating. We've had a few comments in. Ruth says, hi Ruth, how are you? Thank you for joining us. Agreed, Gethin, as an emergency service in the north of England, the majority of our colleagues have been working throughout the COVID. We're looking at what future changes they'd like to see, as well as those who've been working from home. James says, certainly those people who've historically been remote or home workers have noted a feeling of being more included. As meetings are now all on Zoom, they aren't forgotten. Yeah, absolutely. That's my experience as well. James mentions other platforms are available. Yeah, any collaboration platforms are available all around the world. And Suzanne says, I completely agree. Digital platforms have enabled a more inclusive environment. I mean, it's fascinating. We talked about this with Catherine the last week as well, about technology is very good at maintaining relationships, but it's not very good at forming them. And I think when we think about those communications, there are some bits of communications that face-to-face is best, right? A line manager needs to have some face-to-face communication with their people, but for those people where there is an established way of working, they understand each other, I think communications can kind of add an awful lot to the relationship. One of the last points I wanted to cover with you today was how we can use communications to demonstrate care for employees. So it's something I've been really big on over the last 12 months. I think a caring culture at work, we've seen time and time again, produces excellent business results. We have created more vulnerability at work, right? So people have been more vulnerable. People have been on these webinars, our CEO and our Chief People Officer and myself, we've all teared up on some of these webinars because we've started to bring our whole selves to work more than we ever had before. And so I think, you put it there on the screen, we care, I think is an incredibly important message. how do we tell people they care? How do we get them to believe it?
We've all wanted to do something in the last year that just shows the people that we love, that we care about them. I saw something recently about like flower sales have absolutely skyrocketed, and I know I did that as well. I sent my besties Valentine's Day flowers, because I can't do, over the last year you haven't been able to do the things that you usually do with the people that you love. So thinking about how we communicate care has actually been something that we've all been doing, probably in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives. We've also seen, we've seen more of, as I've just said before, we've seen more of our employees' lives. We've had an insight into their decor, how they like to operate, and when they do work from home. So, caring is a tricky concept to communicate. It's something that someone has to feel. You can't just say it. You can't just tell someone you care about them. It's actually something that you need to demonstrate. They need to see it. So there's a couple of things we've been thinking about and how we can communicate that people care. So the first thing is to think about the actions that you take, because if you say something but don't follow up with the appropriate actions, that people will understand care through action, not through words. We've started to work with a couple of customers. We've been calling them care packages, funnily enough, but small packages that are sent to home, maybe with a few goodies. We've been popping chocolate bars in a couple of them, but just help to show that we're thinking about you. We've made a little investment in sending something out to you, where we may have in the past had that, if print has been something that's been on decline, it's definitely something that we've seen increase, and actually we haven't then necessarily had the grumble from employees about investment. It's about just showing something, we're thinking about you, take a minute to think about yourself. That's something around enrolment windows, just taking a moment to think about what you might need for the year ahead, for instance.
I mean, it's fascinating about kind of sending things to people, because I think, I live in an apartment block, so there is always a massive pile of boxes downstairs while people have been kind of social distancing and deliveries, and there is always at any point of the day an Amazon van on site. The online retailers are available, and I think it's fascinating how, I've had bread delivered from local bakers, I've had coffee delivered from kind of local roasters and things like that. So I've had a lot more packages arrive, not just from online shopping, but from actually just exactly say flowers. For the first time in my life, I did a 3-month subscription to flowers being sent to the house. And that's made a nice difference to the house. And I've sent lots of things, like you said, I've sent bottles of wine to people. Vanessa's just mentioned in the chat there that we sent flowers and chocolates to Vanessa's, one of our customers. And so we've done a lot of that with our customers as well, to build connections. And so, yeah, really interesting idea of this resurgence into actually offline communications. And actually, could that be a really good way of us reaching people when they're working remotely? And I actually saw some interesting examples from Arsenal Football Club, and I think the National Trust, over the last couple of years, where they've seen higher engagement. I think Arsenal's created like a little football shirt and customized it to a Sky customer's name. So you get your football shirt with Houlden written on the back. And that became a leaflet that people then kept and put by their computer. And so actually you're advertising a leaflet that people are going to keep and stick on their wall is kind of...
I have a little drawer of like cool advertisements. That's literally just, and it's full of Virgin Media. They communicate so well. I've had little pop-up boxes from them through the post, and thinking about it's not gimmicky. It's something that actually creates just a moment of joy. Something that when people open, they're like, this looks really, really cool. Like print can be sustainable as well. We worked with one customer and we offset the carbon that was used to create it. We used paper from all paper that we used is from managed forests that are there purely to make paper. So yeah, there are ways in which we can also make sure that those common concerns around print are mitigated. So, yeah.
I think so one of the things you mentioned was kind of getting these wellbeing packs sent to people. That's been quite popular. Social media has been full of people kind of uploading a photograph of this little kind of gift or wellbeing pack, to kind of care pack they've been sent by their employers. And I think that starts to tell us an awful lot about the employer brand and the kind of how we perceiving our brand amongst our customers. So, you know, if you are a large kind of utilities provider and your members of staff are sharing these things on social saying what a caring employer I've got, that's a really good PR for your customer experience. And so actually your benefits spend and your benefits communication spend starts to impact other areas of the business. And I think we've seen an awful lot of that over the last 12 months. I've seen some really good examples. And a couple of days ago, Greg sent a kind of video package, you know, with those leaflets you get which plays a video. They sent that to the cast members of Line of Duty and gave them like create a little bespoke video. Barely anything to do. We've used those video cards ourselves. You know, they're not that expensive, but the impact is huge because, you know, Greg's got that shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media. I think
Funny you mentioned that did do the rounds on our communication team.
Yeah,
it really hit mark. Yeah, it just humor, I think, is so important as well. You know, just finding the fun, I think, is really, really important.
And don't lie, this is quite an interesting one. I wrote an article at the start of the pandemic about kind of how important trust is in times of crisis. And I tried to look at some research because I was in my head of, you know, most employers didn't know what the answers were. We didn't know how the situation was going to pan out. The advice from the government was at times kind of sporadic and a bit woolly. So we were starting, you know, even now, you know, employers are kind of going to work on a Monday and saying, yeah, there was an announcement on Friday, but there's still gaps in that. I still don't know what that means. And so I was really interested to find out, do people want the truth, even if the truth is, I don't know, I don't have an answer for you? And I was kind of surprised to find that vast majority of people said that whether it's their employer, business owners, the media or government, they would much prefer you to say, I don't know, and not have an answer than to make up an answer that turned out to be false.
Yeah, integrity is everything. So yeah, there's two sides to this, don't lie for me. It's say when you don't know exactly what you've been saying. It's around making sure that we're communicating with integrity, and that actually something is better than nothing. If you're going out to your employees, keeping them updated regularly rather than waiting for, especially in a pandemic, nothing is going to be the right time. There is no point where everything is wrapped up in a bow and it's a perfect time to communicate something. Actually just making sure you're regular, frequent, pointing to the right resources is really important. The other side is around businesses that have had to make really hard decisions in the last year. You know, we've seen it with some of our customers. They've had to make some really tough choices about investment and you know, and jobs. And actually don't take a tone with your internal communication that doesn't match up with what else is going in your business. Making sure that experience is, again, has integrity to it. If you're having to make difficult decisions, be really open and honest and compassionate about that, but then maybe don't promote something with gusto and take a completely different tone, because your employees will know and they will feel it. It's the experience they get. This is all about the feeling at the end of it. You know, care is all, when we look at communication campaign, we do think, do and feel. What do I want people to think? What do I want people to do? What do I want people to feel? And think and do are really easy. That, you know, that's what call to action do we put in? What information are we sharing? Actually, the feel is the difficult bit, but that's the part of our campaigns we've really seen increase over the last year, is how do I want the employee to walk away from this communication feeling?
And there's a real danger that the real empathetic way that we've communicated stops when the pandemic stops, right? And what an awful experience for an employee to kind of really feel like my employer cares. Pandemic finishes and it's back to business as usual. That we can't let that kind of drop down. That's the new standard people expect, right?
Yes, definitely. People expect to connect with the human behind the role. You know, we've seen businesses where CEOs have been much more, you know, been much more accessible. Have maybe been presenting and there's been, you know, their dog's been in the background, or, you know, the Amazon delivery driver has knocked on the door, as my Hermes delivery driver just did here. You know, it's about that human experience. And if we lose that, we'll have lost everything that we've gained in the last year.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got a question for you from Emma Gervis. Thank you, Emma. By the way, Emma has got a really good video with HR Zone at the moment, talking about how they won the Culture Pioneers Award. So please check that out at hrzone.com. Really, really interesting approach to well-being. Emma has kind of said, what are your thoughts around global communication strategies? We have a global benefit strategy with global benefit pillars, but local flavors. So for example, we have a global medical pillar with local PMI policies in country. How do you suggest we communicate benefits locally to make them relevant, but also ensure we retain those core global messages about strategy? Really common question, really, really common issue, right?
Yes, quite a few of our global customers, we take a toolkit approach. So we agree up front exactly what you've mentioned, those core messages and that strategy, and what those global messages are. So having that toolkit in place to say, actually, when we're communicating, the positioning statement is always this, these are the points we need to hit. These are even the base level communications. You may have something that's drafted as an initial draft that then you work with your local companies to then edit and make sure that it's appropriate, the information's correct, but also maybe some of the tone and the language. If we're working in a different language, for instance, we need to make sure that translations work and things like that. So making sure you've got that global messaging, and also that global strategy around sort of a rollout plan, and a base level approach, I think, is really, really key when you're operating globally. But you're right, that local influence is really important to make sure that the message is going to land. You're going to have subcultures within each of your, within each of your territories. So what works for one might not work for another, even down to as tactical as thinking about your channels. Do you have a suite of communications that you create globally that actually then locally I can dip into? If posters work for me, I have a poster that I can draw down from that toolkit. If an email works for me, I can pull down that. But actually, you've created those communications to create that same experience and the same message.
And with health benefits, PMI is a really good example. It's used different ways by different people in different cultures. So mental health is one of the most common one. Across borders, some countries are much more advanced in how they've removed the stigma about mental health. So if you are a US or a UK centric business that has got this really progressive approach to mental health, thrusting that upon some regions and some countries just does not, we've seen that kind of fall flat on its face. And so that messaging needs a structure, but some leeway, right? So it can be tailored by those local teams who can feed in. I think, we see that with Wellbeing. I think a really important part is to have country champions who can take the framework and deliver something within that, even if that's the same benefit with the same provider. Just as we said at the start of this webinar, the way we talk about it, the language we use, we might point it at a slightly different problem, even though the product is exactly the same, I think is quite important.
Yeah, we might talk about energy levels rather than mental well-being. That it's exactly making sure that we're using language that really is going to communicate the right thing. Yeah, that's definitely something we've seen.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Really, really interesting conversation. I will be back in a few weeks on the 28th of May talking about more communications with the CEO of the Institute of Internal Communications, Jennifer Sproul. I'll also be back on the 9th of June with our corporate benefits team to talk about employee benefits in a post-pandemic world. And in the meantime, if you haven't had your Gethin or Benefits fix, I will be discussing remote work and wellbeing with Champion Health on the 18th, speaking at the Wellness Engage conference on the 19th, and talking to students at King's Business School on the 25th about why employers should care about wellbeing. Alexandra, always a pleasure, always a joy to talk to you. Fascinating experience. If anyone wants to reach out to Benefits to talk about communications, please do. Alexandra and her team are in the best place I think that communications team has ever been. And so please reach out if you'd like to speak to us. And thank you all for your questions, comments, and for attending. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.